Hey guys, it is April from Getting Hygge With It. Today is day one of the Sweet Spring Read series. I'm very excited that it's finally spring. Winter was so awful this year for me in Ottawa, so I'm thrilled. And I'm ready for us to jet set over to France. So I'm going to share with you today all of the books on my shelves that are set in France that I haven't read that I need to read at some point. And I think maybe it's the saying, April in Paris that makes me think of France during the spring. I don't know, maybe that's it. I have no idea. I've got 9 books to share with you set in France, so let's get into it. So the first book I have to share with you is The Paris Wife by Paula McLean. This is set in the 1920s and it starts out in Chicago and we follow Hadley Richardson and she meets a very young Ernest Hemingway and they fall madly in love. And they decide to move to Paris together, and in Paris you meet all sorts of characters. Of course, there's Ernest himself, but you also meet F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald and a ton of other characters. And it's about their whirlwind love affair in Paris in the 1920s. This was raved about by Russell over at Ink and Paper blog, and he was the real reason that I picked this up in the first place. So I've got that on my shelves. A more recent addition from me is The Baker's Secret by Stephen P. Kiernan. And this is a World War II historical fiction book set in France during the German occupation. And we follow this baker. She has a little bakery, and one of the ways that she kind of fights back against the Nazis is through her baking. Because she has a job where she can deliver bread, pastries, whatever, she is also able to send messages to people via her business. And I am assuming this is going to be a highly tense book, knowing that she's got all of these secrets and she's trying to evade the Nazis. It sounds great. I've also got The House I Loved by Tatiana de Rosnay. Now, she wrote Sarah's Key, and I really enjoyed Sarah's Key. But this is set in 1860s in Paris. We follow a woman who is living in this older house that has, I believe, been passed on from generation to generation in her family. And all around her, homes are being knocked down because of Napoleon III. He started this large scale revamp, if you will, of the old Paris, and he's trying to make the buildings look new. As this destruction of her hometown is happening, she is writing letters to her late husband, and it sounds really heartbreaking, and it sounds great. I've also got Sweet Francaise by Irene Nemirovsky. Now, this is on my spring TBR. I really want to read this spring. And this is about people in France during the Nazi invasion. And I believe it moves from Paris to also some smaller villages in France. And we follow a group of people and how they're surviving the Nazi invasion. Now, Irene was in France during World War II, and she was killed during World War II. So she knows this experience inside and out, and lost her life because of it. Now, this is a work of fiction. This is not her telling her own life, and yet you can't help but wonder how much of her life is in here, So I am really eager for this one. I've got 3 Joanne Harris books here. So the first one is 5 Quarters of the Orange. Now, this takes place just after World War II, and this woman comes back home to a small village on the banks of the Loire, and they don't recognize her as the daughter of this infamous woman who they all hold responsible for a tragedy during the German occupation years ago. In this book, we're going past and present. This woman who returns to the small town has a scrapbook from her mother, and this scrapbook contains the secrets of that tragedy. And so we go back and forth in time, and it sounds wonderful, and I've wanted to read it for years. So yeah, that's 5/4 of Bjorn. The next two, again, Joanne Harris, and they're kind of a duology, I believe. So we've got Chocolat, and we've got The Girl with No Shadow. So in Chocolat, we follow Vienne Rocher and her little girl. They move to a little provincial town in France and open up a chocolate shop. And they're people who move around kind of randomly. The wind is meant to tell them when it's time to leave a town and move on to another. And so in this book, they're living in this little provincial town. And then in this book, The Girl with No Shadow, they move to Paris, and there she opens up another chocolate shop. So I just want to read them both. They both sound wonderful. I've watched the movie Chocolat. I actually listen to the soundtrack of Chocolat all the time and really, really like it. So I'm glad I have both of them on my shelves. The next book is Alice Hoffman's The Marriage of Opposites. And in this book, we're following this young woman who has always wanted to move to France, but she has fairly strict parents. It's the 1800s, so she doesn't really have any control over her own life or her own destiny. They marry her off to an elderly man, and he dies, and his, I think, nephew, Frederick, arrives from France, and she falls in love with him. And he is this very famous painter in France. And I believe she ends up moving to France. So I don't think this entire book takes place in France, but there's definitely some elements there, and I believe she does end up there. So that's The Marriage of Opposites by Alice Hoffman. And then the last one is just gonna break my heart. It is A Very Long Engagement by Sébastien Depressot. This takes place in January 1917. 5 wounded French soldiers, their hands bound behind them, are brought to the front at Picardy by their own troops, forced into the no man's land between the French and the German armies and left to die in the crossfire. One of these soldiers' fiancés finds out about this, and she begins a relentless quest to find out whether her fiancé was officially killed in the line of duty or is he still alive. I can't imagine knowing that kind of detail, that they were basically sacrificed in this gross, disturbing way, and not knowing if they're dead or alive. That's just like the worst thing in the world. So I think this is going to be a really hard read, but it sounds really interesting too. So, okay, those are all of the books on my shelves that take place in France. Have you read any of these books? I would love to know. Tomorrow we are going to be back here. We are going to be talking about the newest and latest in thrillers. These are new releases. So I will see you then. Bye guys.